recollections of war. And bullet holes still from the battle for Berlin. Right, so taking a left turn, heading into town, probably because I'm up to 10k steps now and it's a fairly warm day. Probably going to hop on some trams and things like that. That is the aptly named Victory Column. That was 1814, which was once again the victory of the Prussians over Napoleon. Victoria at the top. Once again, it's supposed to be a mirror of the Brandenburg Gate, but the Brandenburg Gate quadriga faces east, and Victoria there faces west. An additional point about the Brandenburg Gate that I neglected to mention earlier is for quite some time, for 3 decades, when the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, it cut off completely the Brandenburg Gate. It was there, it was just all across the front, and essentially was a gate to nowhere. And so for 3 decades it represented division. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, the Prime Minister of East Germany and the Prime Minister of West Germany walked through the gate, one from one side, one from the other, and shook hands. And Germany was officially reunified in October of 1990. Anyway. Badass sign. Awesome. So I'm near Potsdamer Platz, headed for my last stop of the day, which is a museum rather dramatically called the Topography of Terror. Dramatic title, but justified in this case because it is a fairly meticulous, by all accounts, collection regarding World War II and its aftermath. I imagine it'll be a fairly somber visit. I'm just along the way from there. I stopped off, had one of the better ideas I've had all week, which is to get myself a large iced coffee, to which I may have added a fairly healthy amount of whiskey and a short but very good cigar. Berlin, of course, for so long was a city divided. In the aftermath of World War II, Germany as a whole was split into 3 parts: Soviet, American, and British. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet administrative zone, was also split into 3 parts: Soviet, American, and British. The Soviet was the biggest one for obvious reasons, and had by far the most reports, only reports of, well, the same kind of thing humans do whenever somebody's under their heel: extrajudicial killings. Some, to be fair, fairly justified. Rapes, extortion, theft. By far the most, of course, were Soviet. The Russians were very angry after Stalingrad, but very, very dark. And of course that situation where the liaising between between, let's say, the the Western Allies and the Soviets became more and more fractured. Concerns were raised because fair enough, the British and the Americans were not exactly guilt-free in that situation, but the Soviets just, it was just brutal. And communication began to break down. And eventually, of course, lines were drawn figuratively and, of course, literally, with the Iron Curtain being raised, the Berlin Wall being built, and as I mentioned earlier, just cutting off the Brandenburg Gate. With Checkpoint Charlie the only way through. Checkpoint Charlie is a few kilometers southeast of this location. As I mentioned earlier, the Brandenburg Gate, because it was just blocked off by the Berlin Wall, for 3 decades represented division, and now, of course, represents unity, not just of Germany, but of Europe. Helicopter overhead. Anyway, I'm just about to finish this up and head along to the museum. I've had a good day. Hot day. But the coffee has put a spring back in my step, that's for damn sure. Anyway. So, just entering the Topography of Terror. It's literally called that, the Topography of Terror museum. Down here, all the way along there, is what's left of the Berlin Wall. As I say, all the way to the end there, all the way along. Churchill's famous quote in March 1946. Bear in mind that is 10 months after the war was over. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. The Berlin Wall split Berlin in two, Germany in two, and Europe in two. For 30 years. Yeah. I'm just about to walk in. So this building is the location during the war from the late 30s onward. This was the location of the central office of the SS. Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA in German. And this was the location from here, the iron grip that the SS had on this city and Germany as a whole, and the Greater Reich. This was the central office. Walking along past the Berlin Wall. It's only 13 feet high. Graffiti still remaining. Holes blasted through it, obviously ex post facto. Some with the rebar still extant. I didn't want to record too much in there. I spent about an hour inside the museum wandering and reading and recording. And it's a very somber place for obvious reasons. Details the rise of the SS and the division of the SS into specific departments. Departments dealing with the SD, for example, was specifically designed to deal with internal enemies. So enemies of the Reich from within. Members of the party who were becoming less towing the line and more even having doubts about such things. And of course the various departments involved in systematic persecution of the Jews primarily as public enemy number one, but also of homosexuals, of people with existing conditions, disabilities, diseases, chronic diseases like asthma, anything that was seen as non-Aryan, non-master race. And terms were used like eradication. Eradication is a word that we associate with diseases or viruses. Extermination was extensively used, which is a word that we associate with vermin. Of course, we today just call it murder. And while not downplaying in any way the final solution in the Holocaust, it also has to be mentioned that the Eastern Front, the war against the Soviet Union, was perpetrated as one of extermination. When it came to the concentration camps and later the death camps, Polish prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war were just sent to the camps. Initially working as forced labor, and eventually just being put in with the Jews, the homosexuals, the disabled, the Roma, and just killed wholesale, murdered. The Western prisoners of war were treated comparatively according to the Geneva Convention. So you can understand, you really can understand why the Soviets were so vengeful. Brutal as it was. I'm reminded a little bit of a line from, and forgive me for this, Captain America the First Avenger, where Dr. Abraham Erskine, played by Stanley Tucci, he says to Steve Rogers, people forget that the first country the Nazis invaded was their own. And there is a rather large element of truth to that, because in 1933, when Hitler was elected, and the Reichstag fire, I'll go more into that on Tuesday, but essentially to protect the people and the state, freedoms were suspended. Freedom of the press, freedom to gather, freedom to protest. Everything was just taken by the Nazis. And that's when the terror, capital T, really began in earnest and continued for 12 years. Right, well, I've been walking around for 5 hours now, so I am going to go back to my hostel and relax for the evening. I will continue this on Tuesday when I come back in to go to the Reichstag and the Holocaust Monument. All right. I very much hope you're smiling, guys. Let's leave. Behind me is a map of the memorials in Berlin, and as you can see, it is really quite extensive. As I say, predictably enough, that was a very sobering experience, and that's from my perspective. I mean, I'm a British, straight, white male. And as much as I consider myself a fairly empathetic person, and my ability to a certain extent, put myself into other people's shoes is fairly well advanced, but I cannot imagine what it's like walking through a museum like that when it comes to the degree of persecution that people went through, up to and including industrialized murder. If they're any shade other than white, if they're gay, if they're disabled, God knows if they're Jewish or Roma. But of course, Nazi persecution didn't, I mean, that's the most obviously overt aspect, but Slavs too. Slavic people who were pretty white, so Poles and Czechs and Slovaks and Slovenians and all the rest. Funnily enough, I actually met and had a conversation with a white supremacist in Slovenia. I noticed that this lanky, skin-headed kid had a tattoo of 8-8 tattooed on the back of his tricep. And I called him on it. He was working in the place, in the hostel that I was staying. I called him on it. He was really quite brazen about the whole thing. He was obviously, like any given white supremacist, a remarkably stupid person, especially considering that A, his name was Vladimir, B, I questioned him and he was 100% Slavic, and I pointed out that Vladimir means farmer in Russian, and millions of Slavs were killed in the death camps, and yet he wears Nazi iconography, or at least, 8 regards letters of the alphabet, H for Heil Hitler. But yes, anyway, I digress. So, once again, I can't imagine what it's like walking through a place like that. If you are black or brown or gay or Jewish or any of the others, really. Tough times. Again, a movie quote, please forgive me, but there's a line from V for Vendetta, which is a film I watch every November the 5th by Valerie, who is a young lesbian who's captured by the authorities and tortured and murdered. And in her letter, which we listened to, she says, "I don't understand why they hate us so much." Yeah. Anyway,